Well, the title, Encountering the Other, is about as general as it could be, so I want to start really by asking about the experiences in which people actually do encounter the other, not in interreligious or international terms, but just in terms of other people, experiences of love, parenting, loss, surprise, and begin from there and think about how those very ordinary experiences of slightly losing our sense of being in control or in charge of situations begin to teach us something. And then move in from there to think a bit about the challenges of dialogue with the religious other, the national other, and so on.
A very warm welcome to all of you to St Martin in the Fields tonight. Very special welcome if you're joining us in this church for the first time from a different part of the country or a different country of the world. Welcome to the first in the lecture series, Encounter. Our series this year focuses on the way we are changed by the people we meet face to face. We can often hold opinions, judgments, beliefs that support our own way of living, our own worldview. But it is encountering the other that we're called to see things in a new way. Prejudices are broken down. Empathy and a new compassion is discovered, and we are broadened and often deepened by those encounters. What a privilege it is for me at St Martin's to introduce for you tonight our first speaker in this exciting series. It's the Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. Rowan, of course, needs no introduction. He is a man who spent his whole life encountering the other and encountering God. In the course of his ministry, he's met religious leaders around the globe, from popes to the Dalai Lama, to the Grand Mufti, to the archbishops and prime ministers and presidents. But I'm sure he's also been changed and moved by the encounters with everybody he's met. And we're often transformed most when we're least expecting it, by those we meet in poverty and in need. There are few people who listen more attentively and graciously than Rowan Williams, and few people who impart more of a sense of God's presence and God's encounter. It's a huge delight for us at this church that Rowan has agreed to open the Encounters exhibition tonight and to speak to us in the first of these lectures. Before he begins, I just want to outline the evening. First of all, Rowan's going to speak for us. And then I've invited Ben Quash, the Professor of Christianity and Arts in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College, to respond to what Rowan has shared with us. And then a chance for Ben and me to ask any immediate questions to Rowan. And then we'd like to throw it open to you and to ask you if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask Rowan. And I ask you to keep those questions clear and succinct, and questions rather than stories of your own encounters. It now gives me very great pleasure to welcome on your behalf Rowan Williams.
Thank you very much, Richard. As always, it's a privilege and a delight to be able to speak in this wonderful place. And thank you all for joining in the conversation this evening. As you've heard, the exhibition that Nicola Green has put together is to be seen downstairs, and I hope you'll take the opportunity of looking at it. Nicola has chronicled the best part of a decade of meetings between religious leaders. Chronicled that, I think, in order to say that dialogue between faiths is nothing at all if it is not dialogue between persons. And in a way, the 10-year span that Nicola's exhibition covers shows something of the process of a building of relation, not just what you might call camera-ready copy encounters. But given a title as broad as Encountering the Other, I'm painfully aware that I could talk about almost anything for the next 35 or 40 minutes, and the danger is of making it too abstract from the word go. I've no idea why, but there are those who believe that I have a taste for abstractions. So this evening I'm going to struggle very hard against my instincts and try to talk a little bit more directly. I could talk about the other with a capital O and all those complex philosophical discussions about our address by and obligation to the other. But I actually want to begin by inviting all of us to think a little bit about that set of experiences where I meet what I do not own and learn that I live from it. Experiences where I meet what I do not own. That in itself is an abstract enough formulation, but it's not too difficult to put some flesh on it. As you'll see in a moment, meeting what I don't own and what I can't control is something we are all familiar with. And as Richard has already hinted, most of us know that our growth and our well-being depend quite a lot on how we handle those moments when we encounter what we do not own or control. When, as I said, we learn that we live from that. So I began to think about experiences in my own life where that had come home to me. Encountering what was not part of my world, not easily fitted into my world. And I'd go back to an experience in the sixth form. The city where I grew up in South Wales, Swansea, had in my teenage years a very active United Nations Association. Remember those? And the United Nations Association used to organize conferences for school students every year, and a select few were sometimes nominated to go to a national Welsh conference in Coleg Harlech, that great adult education centre in North Wales. And in 1967, I was one of the lucky few to be nominated to go to a conference modestly entitled World Problems in Coleg Harlech. The great thing about the 2 weeks we spent in Coleg Harlech was that they had gone out of their way, the organisers, to invite people from what were in 1967, very diverse and unlikely backgrounds. That was where I first met a student from mainland China, this at the time of the Cultural Revolution, where they had very courageously invited somebody from the South African embassy to try and explain South Africa's apartheid policy to a lot of extremely vocal and critical Welsh teenagers. We had a student from the United States. We had another student who'd just spent a year in Bolivia, where she had lived through a revolution. So for those of us who had had a rather sheltered upbringing in middle-class Swansea in the 1960s, this was a very stretching, a very exciting couple of weeks. And there are many memories I could share, but I'd probably better not. One that does stick, however, has to do with the Chinese student, with the extreme caution with which he answered any question that was put to him, gradually shifting as the time went by to a point where he could make genuinely exploratory comments on what he was seeing in us and became not just an exotic displayed for our edification, but a person we could converse with. And the two things I remember terms of encounter with otherness were first the very obvious one of simply seeing him joining in the singing and self-entertainment that we laid on for ourselves most evenings, and relaxing in that environment and becoming very visibly a student like other students. And the other was a rather haunting comment made in a discussion group. He was talking a bit about communism in China and about the era of Mao Zedong. And he talked about the passion and commitment required to be a member of the Red Guards. And then he said to us, "Of course you understand something of that because you love God." And that sudden, shocking perspective on the Western world from a Chinese communist has stuck with me ever since. We, outside the communist world, understand that kind of passion, dedication, because we love God. Well, what stuck was, I think, the sense that we could talk about love in this context. Love of ideals, love of a future, love of a country, love of God. And while we were coming from about as difficult and different perspectives as we could have come from, it seemed, surprisingly, that there was a language we shared after all. So that's one recollection of an encounter with an other, meeting something not owned, not familiar, not easily absorbed, having the other hold up an utterly unexpected mirror to our culture, unexpected and, I dare say, as distorted as the mirror we held up to him, and finding something we could talk through and think through, and still be thinking through rather more than 50 years later. I wonder if he's still thinking about Coleg Harlech. There are other kinds of moment when encounter with the other puts you in touch very immediately with the difficulty of solving another's problems. And I think it was on my second night as a student in Cambridge that I met, really for the first time, a homeless man wandering the streets who stopped me and asked for help. And like a naive youngster, I thought it might be possible to do something. And we walked around Cambridge for a couple of hours that night, looking for somewhere where he could spend the night. And we didn't find anywhere. But the walk enabled me to understand a bit about him, where he came from, helped me in the years ahead as a student to have other conversations with vagrants, homeless people, getting a little bit of a sense of the story that lies behind statistics around homelessness, and a rather bitter sense of the intractability of the problem. And it is painful to realize that when you want to be a compassionate, creative savior figure, solving other people's problems, 99 times out of 100, you can't, and on the 100th occasion, when you can, you shouldn't. But I mention that as an encounter with the other, not just because it's about, for the first time, trying to listen to and become attuned to the experience of someone who had acute, long-standing difficulties that I was not going to be able to solve. But also, it was an encounter with myself, with the self that wanted to solve problems and couldn't, and had to learn how to live in that difficult place where you want to help and you can't, and you have to come to terms with that and live with yourself as someone who is not necessarily the answer to every neighbour's problems. More of that in a moment. Connected a bit with that, I suppose, is the experience, again as a student, of working with children from deprived and difficult families in South London a couple of years running, and learning something about the experience of children from broken, difficult and violent families. Again, resisting easy solutions, provoking some intense self-questioning, as well as questioning of the system we're part of. And just as on that evening in Cambridge, circling back to the very basic need of simply staying to listen, however difficult the otherness was. Most of us, I guess, will have experiences in our lives when we have met those circumstances where, first of all, we're conscious of being alongside someone whose experience is dramatically different from ours, whose language we have to struggle to speak. And second, coming up against our own longing to be in charge and to resolve, and therefore to pass on. It's why I warm so much, again and again, to the Buddhist language of simply sitting with those questioning realities. But perhaps even more familiar to us as an experience is love. Love fulfilled and love failed. The failures of love are so often something to do with the inability to let a loved person be the person they are. To do with our innate passion, compulsion to write people's scripts for them. And to say, if I love you, you must please me. If I love you, you must follow my script. And when love is fulfilled and really begins to live, it has, doesn't it, everything to do with that willingness to let the loved person be the person they are. It's said so frequently that I feel almost embarrassed to make such an obvious point. But church is a good place for stating the obvious, and I make no real apology for that. Because it is an experience we share. And looking back on our lives, certainly looking back on my own life, I know where the failures of love have been, and I know how much they've had to do with exactly that. Perhaps it becomes most acute in the experience of parenting, when the children we passionately, deeply, obsessively, protectively love actually turn out to be people. Their ideas, their preferences, their lifestyle choices, whatever you want to say, will be theirs. And encountering the otherness of one's own family, one's own children, bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh, is not the least difficult place to encounter otherness, I dare say. And I think for those who are able to receive it, as they say, it's one of those moments where we are challenged to spiritual growth or spiritual recession. Either we are willing to grit our teeth, examine our souls, and loosen our grip, or we're doomed to one of the most painful kinds of bitterness imaginable, the alienation between parent and child. And while we're on difficult moments of encountering otherness, I sometimes used to say to clergy I was about to ordain as priests, deacons, and indeed bishops at times, one of the things you're going to have to get used to is that you're going to have a life from now on in other people's fantasies. We all do. But those of us who dress like this have a very particular role in other people's dreams. And it can be pretty unpleasant, pretty constraining at times. And the otherness of what somebody else thinks of you, the other you that you see through another's eyes, is again a really painfully difficult thing to come to terms with. And without waxing too autobiographical about this, Archbishops of Canterbury do have a certain amount of projection flung at them, and we've seen it, I think, in what's surrounded my successor's profile in the last few days. And I feel for him very deeply, because I know something of the difficulty of living with those extraordinary, monstrous, spectre of the Brocken projections that can surround this office. The experience of an encounter with the other, when it's genuinely the hostile, the suspicious, and the negative other, is hard work. Supremely what I don't own, and supremely what is very hard to live from or live with. Well, we could all of us multiply instances. I've simply tried to give you just a flavour of one or two areas where I feel I've been allowed to see something of the underlying problem in my own experience. But in all these contexts, what it seems we are summoned to do, or even, in a strange sense, empowered to do, is to take the uninvited that comes to us and invite it. To take the uninvited and invite it. Not accept it passively, but invite it in the sense of saying, this is given me in order to think, in order to feel afresh, in order to grow. When I do invite the uninvited in that way, when I'm able to say, I haven't wanted this and I couldn't want it and I don't want it, yet I must invite it into the space of my heart and soul, when that happens, it certainly involves a real yielding of control, a yielding of ownership. I'm inviting into my territory, my soul, all sorts of things whose effects I can't predict or measure. And yet I do it because of that strange conviction that somehow it is only in that sort of encounter that life enlarges, grows, becomes something other itself. And I suppose that's got something to do with what I was describing in relation to my Chinese friend all those years ago. Finding a familiarity, a common language, where you'd expected a different universe. And if you know that can happen, you'll be all the more likely to be able to invite the difficult, the unpredictable stranger. Just those few experiences of finding there's something recognizable at the heart of what you thought alien, and the world does begin to shift on its axis. It happens the other way around, of course. We find a deep otherness where we thought we'd find familiarity or common ground. A person's foes shall be those of their own household, says the Lord. And we were talking a little earlier downstairs about the way in which the conflicts between faiths seem at times to be as nothing compared with the conflicts within faiths, when people's enemies are those of their own household, and where you look for an echo, a resonance, an understanding, and you find an alien universe. no easy ways through that. But the question is whether we actually do want to grow, whether we want our humanity to stay where it is, safely consuming its own matter, or whether we want food. When we want food, we have to open up. We have to take what is other into ourselves. And once we've understood that basic human reaction, taking what's other into oneself so that we live, once we've understood that at the material level, something about it comes through at the spiritual level too, I dare say. Now, I've hinted already that one of the things that happens in encountering the other in these ways is encountering oneself in a fresh way, finding the self I never knew. That can be wonderful, and it can be terrifying. The encounter with what's other in the heart of myself is a deeply difficult moment, because I may find that in a moment of crisis or pressure, I will not do what I've always said I'll do. My default setting appears to be something other than what I hoped and thought it would be. My image of myself dissolves. I realize I'm capable of doing less than I am and being less than I am. Just as, savingly and hopefully, there are occasions where I surprise myself and find that I've become, it seems, more than I am. There's an otherness that's positive as well as negative. And the stranger within me is not just the embarrassing stranger who is capable of falling at the first hurdle, but the baffling stranger who seems not to worry about the things that I always thought I was worried about. So that experience of finding within myself reactions and decisions and dispositions that I didn't know were there, in a heart that is strangely alien to me, that too must come under this general rubric of encounter with the other. And of course it entails recognizing that I don't own myself. That, like everything else I've been talking about, can be utterly terrifying and utterly liberating. I don't own myself. I don't know what's going on in here. I haven't got a tidy, finished version of myself that is going to perform satisfactorily as I would like it to. And that means, of course, that because I don't own it, it lives even where I don't know it. My life is more than what I know. My life is more than what I know. And while that can be frightening, it's also frighteningly exciting. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, you remember at one point that Prospero says of Caliban, "This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine." Prospero looks at what is apparently a monstrous, villainous character and says, "No, that's me too." And as has often been said, pretty well everything that happens on the island in The Tempest happens in Prospero's mind. That recognition of the other within, the stranger within, that inviting of the life within that I don't know and don't control, that's a key moment, once again, in opening ourselves to the possibility of growth and of building freedom. If I am what I own and what I understand and no more, is there any sense in which I'm free? Any very interesting sense in which I'm free? Probably not. So this thing of darkness this unexpected, unpredictable set of reactions and dispositions, sometimes dangerously disappointing, sometimes alarmingly creative. That's an encounter of colossal significance. Well, thus far, I've been thinking aloud a bit about some of those experiences where we sense the depth of otherness, where we recognize familiarity in those depths, and sometimes when we recognize depths of otherness in what seems familiar. About those experiences where I become a stranger to myself. I don't know really who I am any longer. I don't know what is natural to me, how to react. Experiences where I manage somehow to recognize the strangeness within as life-giving, and so see something of the strangeness outside also as life-giving. As I think aloud about these things more and more, of course, there presses in from round the edge of all this that most fundamental and challenging encounter with otherness, which is our presence to the divine. Through quite a lot of Christian history, never mind Jewish and Muslim history as well, there's been what you might describe as a shot silk effect in talking about God. You look at it from one angle and it's this colour, you look at it from another angle and it's that colour. Look at it from one angle, and God is the most intimate, the most natural reality of all. God is the one for whom our hearts are made. God is the one who is the fulfillment of all our desires.
Thank you very much.
God is what we're for. And humanity, when it is itself, naturally lives its way into communion with the divine. Shift the fabric of the cloth just a little bit, and God is that for which there are no words, that for which no expectation can possibly make sense, that which is by definition, by stipulation, completely beyond our control, that which supremely we do not own and cannot take for granted, that which puts everything we say and do and are under scrutiny and judgment, and it seems sometimes annihilation. And the odd thing is that all through these centuries, Christians, Jews and Muslims, not to mention Buddhists, Hindus, Jains and Zoroastrians and whoever else, have walked the tightrope between those two perceptions, as if there's a deep recognition somewhere that God is indeed that most uncontrollable of realities about which nothing can securely be said that will fit our categories, and yet that all our speech and our action, all that we are, is oriented towards that mystery. It was summed up classically in the 15th century by the great theologian Nicholas of Cusa, where he simply describes God as the non-aliud in Latin. Not another thing. Not another thing. Not a big thing added to the list of small things. Not a divine thing over against the worldly thing that we inhabit. Not another thing. So different that God's difference is different from all the differences we can imagine. And so, for that very reason, never in competition with us, never trying to ease us out to get more space, but just divine, just being what there is to be. And for Christians, something of that, of course, is what is very literally embodied in our central story. Here is a human life, utterly familiar, utterly recognizable, doing something utterly radical and utterly unrecognizable as a divine moment in the history of our world. But that's perhaps another story. But the point I'm moving laboriously towards is simply to say that there's a kind of to and fro between the way we talk about encountering otherness in our general experience and the way we talk about encountering the otherness of God. As if the more attuned we become to living in a world that we don't control and which yet nourishes us, the more we can sort of see what this God language is about. And the more we grasp something about the God who is both unimaginably intimate and unimaginably different, the more perhaps we can go and invite the uninvited and the uncontrollable and learn to live from it. Belief in a God who can be encountered is not belief that there is, as it happens, one more bit in the universe than we'd expected. Just as, when you're clearing out a room, you may discover that there's one book under the cushion in addition to the 16 you carried out from the table. Some mysterious extra. Not like that. But that for us to be ourselves, to be human, is in some way for us to live in a readiness to be gifted and enlarged and enriched by what isn't us. Our readiness to move into that territory we don't control. Something about our humanity which is constantly in itself transcending. And that if we shrink our own sense of what's humanly possible to what we can own, we can't be too surprised if we end up looking very much less than human. We're in a culture which is pretty obsessed with ownership, which often takes property as the fundamental relationship that we can have to anything, and sometimes to anybody. A culture which is extremely averse to letting go, and very frightened of loss of control, however much it's resistant to the control of another. A culture which is frequently pretty confused about how we encounter the other. And so a culture which, in times of general crisis and anxiety, very often reaches for the simple solution of denying the other and shutting down the systems. But if we are made by and for the God who is unimaginably familiar and unimaginably different, we may perhaps recognize that that's not where we as human beings are destined to live. I've told one or two stories this evening. I'll finish with one very recent encounter, just, in fact, a couple of days ago. A conversation I was privileged to be involved in, at the heart of which were two people from Rwanda. One of them a survivor of the genocide, another whose family had been involved with the Hutu government at the time of the genocide. Before the conversation we shared, they had spent hours, just the two of them, working out whether it was safe to talk to each other, and also whether it was safe to talk to each other in front of other people. A little surprisingly, they decided that it was safe to talk to each other and that perhaps the rest of us were to be trusted as well. But as the day went on, It became very clear in their conversation and the conversation that they made possible for the rest of us, that if there was any way forward out of this almost unimaginably bitter and difficult kind of otherness that they represented, it had something to do with how they were to create between them a space that belonged to neither of them, but could give room for both. They were exploring how to encounter an invited otherness on the far side of bitter standoff, a zero-sum game of suffering and reproach and guilt, asking what the new space might be that neither of them owned. And I think we all came away from the conversation with a very much intensified sense of how encountering the other becomes truly gracious when we at last learn how to say goodbye to the fantasies of ownership. Perhaps that's what faith, finally, has to offer in the world of walls and ditches and wire and border controls.
I'm very glad you ended with those two words, border control, because I had written them down as the two first words I wanted to begin with as I listened to you. It seems to me that a great deal of the subtext of what you've been talking about, and indeed Nicola Green's exhibition in the crypt area, not the crypt, what do you call it, the crypt, Richard? The crypt area. It's too sort of beautifully illuminated to be a crypt. Is exploring this question of what it would mean even to think about borders, which is not to say they have no place, but to think about them in new ways as a consequence of a vision of God in which we all stand before the face of God. The great Latin phrase in Christian tradition, coram Deo, before the face of God. There is, as it were, nowhere that is not before the face of God, and that means there is nowhere you can be that is not at the same time the place that others are. So whatever particular sense you might have of what makes you different from the others around you cannot reach to the point where you say they are not also before the face of God. And most fundamentally, therefore, I think for any religious tradition that's not merely one that has gods that look after a small local patch of the world, the most fundamental challenge is how may I regard those who are religiously different from me, as well as maybe politically and in all kinds of other ways, as nevertheless also related to the God who relates to me. Another way of putting that same challenge is fundamentally to affirm that we inhabit together one world. That the world we see around us with all its variegation, all its differences, is not merely a chaotic amalgamation of rubble, that what we look at as we see the many differences that surround us is not merely a sort of set of random mutations that amount to nothing but rubble, but nevertheless, but rather something that collectively honours and points to a single origin and a single end. And that too seems to me a necessary implication of a belief in the world as in some way the creation, the expression, the outpouring of divinity, of one God. So border control becomes a very complex sort of question when these two interrelated ideas are in play. First, that we all together stand coram Deo, before the face of God, and that there is only one world, although there may be an indefinite number of different perspectives on that world. The second thing, which is again simply to echo, I think, what Rowan has shared so beautifully, is to insist again, as Nicola's exhibition does downstairs, that reflecting on these issues can never merely be a matter of abstract theory. And that's why the personal stories that Rowan has told tonight are, and the very personal documentation of people that Nicola's exhibition shares are essential. These are not just, as it were, accidental to the question of how different religions interrelate. They are essential to it. They are always embodied encounters between particular people and those people as themselves the product of particular histories and traditions and worlds of thought. This is never, if it's ever to be useful, a merely abstract set of theories about, for example, all religions being fundamentally the same thing, or indeed essentially all different. One of the things that a lot of interfaith encounter has been tempted by, two of the things I should say that interfaith dialogue and encounter have been tempted by are the options to go either for assimilation or elimination. Assimilation, or to put it slightly differently, kill or marry. Kill, so either become one flesh with that which is other to you, which is a lovely thing in lots of ways, but can easily become, as it were, the destruction of real difference, or the other option, which is also a destruction of real difference, which is the elimination of the other, the killing option. And it seems to me that there's something in between those two which ought to be on the highest priority for those of us who are negotiating an increasingly dangerous world in which a lot of the political discourse has lost the power to both conceive and articulate what it would mean to find a way between these two options. I would call it friendship. Befriending is something that is neither the elimination of difference or the total assimilation of the other. And the challenge of finding forms of friendship between religious traditions seems to me of the highest priority. And the wonderful thing about that, as Rowan has again shared with us, is not about not being ourselves, it's about, or not allowing the other to be themselves, but rather to find ways in which that difference becomes the very resource you draw upon in order to draw near to one another and create things together to, as Rowan put it, to build freedom. And in another lovely phrase, to find an alarming creativity in the fact that there are initiatives and ideas that are not your own, but that can nevertheless change the way you think, feel, and act. Those are some initial responses. The last thing I think I'll say, just to kind of get us going in more of a discussion, is to put a question. Given this, on the one hand, this vision of one world, this idea that we're all coram Deo, before the face of God, and given the imperative not merely to be abstract, and therefore to tell stories of particular encounters between particular embodied individuals, the question I have is, what do we do about institutions and traditions? So the deep wisdom that Rowan has shared about what it is to meet another human being, and repeatedly to meet many other human beings over the course of a lifetime, is something indispensable to all of us. But there is then that question, which again Nicola Green's exhibition provokes, which is, what do you do when that individual human being is also a carrier of something that is much larger than themselves, as it were, a shared and collective identity, something that they are required sometimes to speak for when it might not be their most natural or instinctive personal language? What is it to be a representative figure, someone who must speak for others and not only for themselves? And what does that bring to sorts of encounters that the world also needs for its flourishing? Institutions, traditions, histories, and it's another of the great challenges, it seems to me, to us now in our present moment, to rediscover how to be able to speak for others and not only for ourselves, not least when the pressures of a certain kind of identity politics often seem to require us to speak for no one but ourselves, and therefore to fragment us all the more. So I leave that as a question, and I look forward to all of our discussion together.
Thanks so much, Ben. Let me just think a little bit about your actual question at the end. It seems to me that when we are encountering somebody who, as you say, stands for more than just themselves, we have to recognize that what they're saying to us and with us is in some way also made possible by the hinterland they come from. That, however unlikely, that long background that has shaped them in some way has given them the capacity to engage, not just to close doors. And similarly, if I'm speaking on behalf of the Christian tradition to which my loyalty and my heart are given, I need somehow to convey in the encounter that I have to honour the range of that tradition and the depth and solidity of that tradition, because I'm not quite sure what it is in all that that's made it possible for me to be here now. So each one of us, I think, is called on in that sort of encounter to recognise that, yes, there's a very complex depth behind institutional, traditional, historical, which has perhaps surprisingly made this encounter possible. And because we don't quite know, as I say, where it comes from in the tradition, we don't just tear up the institution, the history. We try to read for ourselves and for the other the way in which a tradition does indeed come to this point of contact. So I really do recognize the issue that you're talking about, and it's something that I recognize as part of the discussions and debates I find myself in actual interreligious encounters, where somebody has explained courteously, patiently, and imaginatively why they can't just repeat back to me what I've just said. No, I can't say that. I see where you're coming from, but I can't say that myself because the world I live in points me in this direction and that direction, shows me this sort of connection, that sort of connection. I can't ignore all that and just agree. But let's see where that goes, rather than saying that's where the discussion stops. The institutional question is a really interesting one, because I think we're very muddled about institutions these days and don't quite know how to get good ones. That's again, another story.
I was very fascinated by the phrase you used when the two Rwandans were talking to each other. You said, a space that belongs to no one, but creates space for both of them, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Where can we find spaces like that, and how can we create spaces like that within our church? Mm.
I think how you create those spaces was exactly the practical question we were left with last Saturday, thinking through how you might literally stage, how you might make possible that sort of encounter. Who would need to be there to guarantee the safety of people speaking in that sort of space? And I don't think there's a general answer to that. I think it's just, that's what we've got to work at. But you're utterly right in saying that religious communities and institutions have a very distinctive role in that. When we're doing our job, I think that's the kind of space we ought to be seeking to create. And the more churches or other religious bodies get sucked into ethnic identities, into class identities, and all the rest of it, the harder that gets. I remember reading an article years ago about some shamanistic practices in Latin American tribes. The shaman, the magician of the tribe, when there was deep conflict, would summon people to a village assembly and then would literally draw a circle in front of him in the middle of the assembly and say, that's the space you now have to enter in order to speak to one another. And what you say there is holy. You better be pretty damn careful what you say there, because that's the space I am giving you, and don't mess around in it. And that's how you resolve conflicts. Something to be said about sacred space there of a rather more, let's say, invigorating kind than some of the language we use about sacred space.
Thank you. I want to ask another question now. If you go downstairs, and hopefully everyone will go down after this, and look at Nicola Green's exhibition, you see a life-size Rowan Williams, but you also see a life-size version of lots of religious leaders. A lot of them, actually, all of them, seem to be men. What would you have to say about religious leaders always being men, the encounters with men? And what could you say about a new world order in which women also have an equal voice within religious circles?
I believe there's a new Bishop of London, isn't there? It's a start. Yes, I mean, I've not talked about that particular kind of otherness, which has to do with gendered otherness at all this evening, and that's a big gap in what I've said, one of many big gaps in what I've been talking about. It's, I think, an acute case of the way in which historic institutional traditional power has, as a matter of bare fact, largely been male. And in a quite different context, of course, that of a Cambridge college, we often worry about the fact that all the portraits on the walls of our college are of men, because the heads of the college over the years have been men. It's an issue. And it has to do, as I say, with historic models of power, with patriarchy, to use the simple word, and the otherness, therefore, that you'll see in the exhibition is limited in its scope because of that. The way in which a gendered otherness comes into and affects and modifies the sort of otherness we're celebrating in the exhibition will be, I think, in generations to come, an increasingly searching and, I hope, generative thing. It would be interesting, I think, to ask Nicola a bit how she found dealing with an almost entirely masculine cast of religious leaders there.
You talked a bit about holiness. What do you think are the characteristics of holiness? And in those leaders that you met, you've met the Dalai Lama, you've met popes, you've met religious leaders from all over the world. What would you identify as qualities of holiness, qualities of otherness that transformed you in the meeting with them?
There's an old chestnut which I've often gone back to in meeting people like this, that holy people make you feel rather more than yourself. Merely good people make you feel rather less than yourself. In other words, good people make you think, oh dear, I could be so much better. Holy people take you as you are. And there's a directness of response and invitation and welcome, and a sense of simultaneously being seen through and embraced. And thinking of holy people I've known, the Dalai Lama ranks quite high on that scale, I think simply because he's somebody who seems so wholly at ease in his body and his heart and his mind, and doesn't come over as someone who is ever defending a corner. He doesn't have to defend himself against you. He's there. He's with you. But a quite different kind of holiness, I think, was what I experienced in the one time I met Pope John Paul II. Not somebody whose views I agreed with in a variety of ways. Not somebody, I think, always with the right answers. Yet, that sense of being seen through and embraced at the same time, the intensity of his gaze, this was in his old age, when he was barely communicating at all, but the intensity of a gaze which was both relentless and luminous was unforgettable. But my most treasured memory is of the man who was, for some years, my spiritual director, Father Joe Warrilow of Quor Abbey in the Isle of Wight, about whom there's a book by Tony Hendra, which some of you may know. And it was, I think in that case, again, the utter immediacy of response. Nothing of defensiveness, nothing of point scoring, nothing of boundary patrolling, but an instantaneous being there. And
nothing of ownership or possessiveness.
Exactly, nothing of ownership. And because of that, God comes through. Here's somebody who is not putting up barriers to you because he's not putting up barriers to God. Thank you. Very interesting question to start with. I think the part of the political correctness agenda you describe, the ultra sensitivity to possible offence, arises not only out of fear, but out of a sense that people don't trust one another. Very often, and others in this audience will, I'm sure, have more to say about this, quite often, what may be in the abstract, may sound in the abstract like a very challenging way of speaking or an exclusive or difficult way of speaking, is possible when people know that the speaker is in some sense on their side. They're not out to annihilate or silence. And that's the difficulty we're in, that we silence, or we seek to silence certain kinds of speech because we have no trust that we've got the capacity to build relationship across these divides. And that's why I find myself in huge perplexity about free speech issues. Like a good liberal in many ways, I'm all in favour of free speech. I'm also very conscious that in a mistrustful and divided society, free speech is pretty unhelpful at times. But you can't solve it just by legislation. You have to solve it by trust building. And I think the best defense, if you like, of Christian language in public is the capacity of Christians to use that language gratefully and confidently without aggression and exclusion. And we haven't been very good at that, so it's time we started learning. Yeah, that's another big one. And I'd like to hear Ben on this in a moment, but let me just but let me respond very, very briefly to that. One of my heroes in the interfaith world is someone who fits very badly into most of the categories of interfaith dialogue, and that's a man who is partly Spanish and partly Indian, Rowan who died not so very long ago. Panikar was somebody who had grown up as a Roman Catholic, who began his academic career writing about how certain elements in Hindu tradition reflected Christian theological themes, entered more and more deeply into Hindu theological categories, recast some of what he wanted to say as a Christian in those terms, later in life found Buddhism fed him in all kinds of ways, and you couldn't put him easily on any map. Is he liberal? Is he conservative? Is he inclusivist? Is he exclusivist? Is he syncretistic? He's Rowan Panikar. And anyone who ever met him or knew him will know just what a radiant individuality he had. So when I think about that sort of question, I think of someone like Rowan. I think of how people, without, as I said earlier, tearing up the institutions and the tradition, can inhabit their world more and more deeply by inviting more and more. I can't myself envisage a world religion And that's partly a failure of my own imagination, but I have no idea what it would be like. I can't envisage a world religion which required everybody to let go of what was most central in their history, their commitment, and their vision. The question really is, how does that sense of absolute centrality, of answerability to truth, how does it somehow move towards something a little bit more convergent and less rivalrous? And for the moment, that's work enough for me. But Ben, I'd really like to hear
I'm not sure I can add much to that, except to say that I think syncretism, if it means a sort of melding, immediately awakes in me a certain caution, even suspicion, that actually there is probably one dominant narrative that's leading the way, and that others are being corralled into it. So one of the great experiments in 20th century philosophy of religion, with many advocates here in the UK, was a certain approach to the study of religious difference, which thought that in the end the idea of salvation was that which united most religious traditions, if not all. And I think rightly that's been exposed as a kind of subterranean Christian narrative that was quietly, in a soft imperialism, was quietly co-opting the narratives of other religions. So syncretism on the whole, I want to spend an awful lot of time interrogating in the concern that really there might be one narrative seeking to commandeer the other ones. Exchange is a much more attractive idea to me, and on that more positive side, I think that almost all, if not all, major religious traditions are the product of centuries of productive exchange. And that's as true of their material culture, their art, as it is of their doctrinal beliefs. And that is a deeply enriching thing. They are not hermetically sealed realities, none of them. And they've lived alongside each other in different periods of history, sometimes disastrously and sometimes beautifully, productively. So we actually are, as members of different religious traditions, already we've got a bit of each other's DNA.
Thank you.
Thank you. The short answer, obviously, is we engage humbly and repentantly. That's to say, we recognize in ourselves corporately what I talked a bit about individually. We look at ourselves through the eyes of another. We see the stranger, the unwelcome stranger in ourselves, in our history. We as Christians look at the mirror held up to us, as you say, by others. We say, well, the so-called Christian West has, in fact, cemented its identity by the exercise of power, by slaughter, domination, and enslavement. How are we supposed to engage with Christianity apart from that history? And the beginning of wisdom, I suppose, is simply that the Christian says, I'm prepared to look at that history through your eyes and see, ask myself, how did we get there? So, not a short task, but it's essential to be reminded that that is, that's the perception we live with. That's a very good question. Well, I suppose people often say, don't they, that the opposite of otherness is identity. But I guess that what I'm taking for granted in what I've been working through is, yes, that there is such a thing as the self, that it is constantly being shaped by, constituted even by, its engagements, its relations, that partly because of that, it's never something which is a complete object for me, and equally it's not something I can therefore just deny and say, well, I'm going to be selfless and absorb myself in the other. That's not the answer. So there are things to be said for selfhood understood as that continuing project of letting myself be shaped in relationship. There is a place that I occupy and others don't, and that's a place where I feed into the life and the well-being of the other. I don't just cancel out one term of it. And I think that's a mistake that's easy to make, especially in the world of religious rhetoric, where selflessness is sometimes taken to be just crossing through, rather than letting go of that tight, objective, finished self. So, could go on, but that's where I begin to respond. So, identity conceived just as my identity with myself, my situatedness in, my possession of this place, and that's it. That's a completely inadequate model of how the world works, not only interpersonally, but generally, metaphysically. Let me think a bit about what actually happens in a good interreligious dialogue. I don't think that the two parties, or more parties, come away at the end simply thinking, I'm right, what a lot of nonsense that was, or I don't know whether I'm right or not, or I must change my mind. They will, if it's worked at all, be thinking something like this: God be praised for an exchange in which I have had to look into my own heart and my own beliefs at a new depth. God be praised for an exchange in which certain perspectives I would never have come up with are presented to me to make more sense of where I am. What that will lead to, how much difference that will make, I can't tell. But I think it's important to recognize that a good dialogue is good not because it produces a victory for one side, but because it goes beyond a standoff, because it allows some identification with what isn't you or yours, because therefore, it gives you some added life. So when I go into a dialogue event with, well, as I often did in my old job, with some Muslim friends and neighbours, I don't expect either that there will be a sudden rush of baptisms at the end of the week, or a sudden rush of conversions to Islam. I expect that, picking up something Ben said, some of the ways in which I cast my questions will have been very usefully challenged and reworked. I expect that some sheer human mutual fidelity will have been created, some trust, even some enjoyment of each other. I know, I've seen it. I will come away with the sense I've seen somebody else in love with God in a particular way, and that's a gift for me. All of that is what I take as part of a constructive dialogue encounter. And it's quite difficult to nail down output and impact in the way that some metrics would like. But what makes it worthwhile is the growth in trust or enrichment that comes with it. Lots more that could be said, but that's where I'd start answering.
Could we ask Ben, because he's been involved in this...
Just very briefly to echo Rowan, I suppose want to just expand the word right in terms of being right to include not just whether one's propositions are kind of watertight, but whether one's life is relationally right. So the business of being right, certainly speaking as a Christian theologian, always also entails whether my encounters with those around me are part of the ongoing transformation of myself into deeper relationship, both with Christ the God revealed in Christ and the world in which everything is, which is the gift of that God. And so to come away from a conversation like that with the question of what's been right about it always also has to entail that question about the transformation of persons, and not just the sort of the security of what one holds to be true propositionally.
Yeah.
The question is, well, it's two questions, I think, and one is to do with the level of extreme polarization and what I'd call toxification of our national discourse in and around Brexit. And the other question is about, if I heard correctly, the relative reluctance of churches in the West to be clear about atrocities elsewhere in the world. The second one is, in some ways, the easier. I think it's essential that the churches raise their voices for all victims. I think also, again, looking back to another job I had, it's quite important to try and find out from people closest to such situations what kind of intervention is likely to be helpful and what isn't. And I can remember one occasion when I was being pressed quite heavily to say something clear and robust in public about persecution of Christians in Myanmar, Burma. And I contacted some of my colleagues in Burma to say, of course, we support, what's the most useful thing for us to do or say? And what came back was rather clearly, if you say anything in public, we will suffer more. And that's, it's tough to hear, because you want to be the solution to people's problems, or you want to sound prophetic or whatever. But it's important, I think, to keep that in mind as well. Not as an excuse, but just as, a bit of prudence. Now, on Brexit. It's not just here, it's across the Atlantic, it's across Europe. We seem to have got into a position where political debate is pure standoff. That's to say, there are self-contained and self-righteous ideologies confronting one another, which are incapable of imagining that territory that neither of them owns, and unwilling to move into that. As you might guess, I wasn't exactly 100% happy about the result of the United States election, but it seemed to me that whoever won it, even if it had been a Democrat victory, the deep, intolerant polarization of society would have been exactly the same problem. In other words, we would not now be looking at a harmonious and peaceful United States if Hillary Clinton had won. On the contrary, we'd be looking at a society whose deep divisions were as manifest in some ways as they are now under the present president. And it's that unwillingness to move towards an active and critical sense of the common good that worries me in all this. How we move forward, I don't know, but I just wonder about what kind of education we're offering, not just in political theory or civic literacy, but what kind of education we're offering in political debate in our education institutions. How far are young people being encouraged really to debate in the sense of looking for language that will take you a little bit beyond the standoff? And, well, I don't know quite how you achieve that, but that's the task. And it's a bit urgent because, to paraphrase the great novelist T.H. White, you don't want to end up just as monkeys throwing nuts at each other from different trees, which is where the current polarization is rapidly moving. Intensified, I think, by the style and rhetoric of online controversy, but that's a subject in itself.
When Rowan defined holiness, he said it was something about making the other feel better than they had felt about themselves before, about listening with grace, about respecting and about trusting. And I think in the way that Rowan has answered our questions and spoken to us tonight, he's not only talked about that, but he's also modelled it. In fact, he's modelled it throughout his ministry. So on your behalf, I'd like to thank Rowan Williams for all he's presented and answered for us tonight. Thank you.